Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Linna. I'm a senior lecturer with a joint appointment here at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and McCormick School of Engineering, and I'm the director of Law and Technology Initiatives. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this Northwestern University program, AI Regulation: Will U.S. and EU Approaches Lead to Fairness and Accountability? This program was organized by AI at NU and the Northwestern Law and Technology Initiative. AI at NU is a community of researchers, educators, and students across Northwestern advancing artificial intelligence in theory and practice. The Law and Technology Initiative is a partnership between Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, McCormick School of Engineering, and external partners. The Law and Technology Initiative focuses on providing programs like this one and developing technologies to improve legal services delivery, including in our interdisciplinary innovation lab. Now I'll turn things over to my colleague, Northwestern Pritzker School of Law professor, Laura Prajazza-Fariña, who will moderate today's program. Laura.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, and it's a pleasure to be here moderating this panel. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll introduce our wonderful panelists. So I'm Laura Prajazza-Fariña. I'm a professor of law here at Northwestern. My main specialty is in intellectual property and patents. And of course, patents and AI intersect a lot. But today we are not talking about patents. We're talking more squarely about AI and about the ethical issues surrounding AI. I have a wonderful group of presenters who will take us from understanding sort of the technical aspects of AI and how those technical aspects interface with issues of fairness and issues of sort of black boxing of AI. We're also going to talk about initiatives, legislative initiatives that are being put forth to deal with issues of fairness in AI. And we'll talk about legal issues in AI and end on a comparative note, right? Talking about how the US and Europe might differ in their efforts to regulate AI. So I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one. And our panelists will first give us presentations, for around 5-minute presentations. So we'll hear from all the panelists. And after that, I'll kick things off with a question or a series of questions. But everybody, please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye out for questions. And I'll be moderating and picking questions from the chat as well. So first, we have Professor Gina Matthew, who's a professor of computer science at Clarkson University, who's here to tell us a little bit more about the technical and ethical interface in AI.
Thank you, Laura, and hello, everyone. I'm going to put a link to some resources in the chat. I'm very delighted to be here with all of you. We had an initial pre-meeting, and it left me very excited to have this conversation with all my fellow panelists. To kick this off, I was asked to kind of start with, why are we looking at regulating this space in the first place? And I bet that for most of the people listening, it is not a surprise that AI is increasingly being used to make critical decisions about the lives of individuals and critical decisions that influence our societies as a whole. So that, of course, is one huge reason. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that here in the introduction. I would like to talk a little bit about why market forces are insufficient, why we need regulation. I think as citizens of the modern world, we're used to software getting better and better over time. We've all experienced software glitches on our cell phones and our word processing programs, whatever, and we have a belief that it will get better over time. But I think market forces are insufficient to incentivize that in many of the situations we're talking about, because the interests of developers are, it's difficult to debug software. It's difficult to make it do exactly what you want it to do. And if you can avoid some of that deep testing and verification and validation work, it is too easy to do that. And the people purchasing the software, the deciders, have interests that are very different from those people being decided about. And between those two things, we don't necessarily get software over time that iteratively will protect the interests of those being decided about, let alone the very legitimate legal rights of the people being decided about in regulated areas such as hiring and housing and credit and criminal justice and many, many important things. So another thing I'd like to mention in terms of why regulating the space is so important is that it's really not possible for consumers or citizens to double check these things themselves. It's not, it's kind of like bridge infrastructure. You can't get out and check each bridge before you drive across it, or verify, each meal in a restaurant before you eat it. We really need regulation to bring the health and safety for individuals and for societies as a whole. Also in this kicking off, I wanted to make a brief note about the relationship between artificial intelligence and automated decision-making systems more broadly. And I generally like to think about automated decision-making systems regardless of the complexity inside. Very complex AI technologies bring some additional challenges with explanation for anyone involved in developing them, even those of us, who are computer scientists. But explanations for everyone, all the stakeholders, is important. I would also like to mention that I'd like to advocate for identifying tiers of automated decision-making systems based on their impact on people, and having tiered requirements of verification and validation and testing and explanation and processes for redress that are appropriate to the level of impact of those systems. So the last thing I'd like to say is the role of professional societies like ACM and IEEE in advocating for things like this. And I think I will leave my introductory remarks there and pass the mic on to others.
Great, thank you so much, Gina. And we have next Rashawn Colbert, who's the research director for the office of Cory Booker in the US Senate.
Hey there, thanks. Thanks to everyone. Thanks, Laura, Dan, Sarah, all my fellow panelists, and the Northwestern AI community. So as you said, my name is Rashawn Colbert. I'm Senator Booker's lead staffer on technology, telecommunications, and a variety of commercial issues. So I'm here today to talk to you about one of our recent legislative proposals, the Algorithmic Accountability Act. Automated systems are increasingly making critical decisions about Americans' health, finances, housing, educational opportunities, and many more things, and potentially exposing Americans and the international community to new risks from flawed or biased algorithms. So to address that, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, first introduced by Senators Booker and Wyden and Representative Clark in the House in 2019, with a new and expanded version introduced just last month. The bill requires companies to assess the impacts of automated decisions they use and sell. So it creates new transparency about when and how those automated systems are used, and empowers consumers to hopefully make informed choices about these processes and what they'll do. In the bill, we use the terms automated decision process, automated decision systems, and those are set to address a pretty wide variety of systems that use computation. They can range from machine learning, statistics, other data processing techniques, and artificial intelligence. So as my fellow panelists mentioned recently, it's not just extremely complex and technologically advanced systems that we're trying to shed more light on with this legislation, but they're all the places where various data inputs are being used to automate decisions, whether it's advanced artificial intelligence or a series of spreadsheets. Senator Booker has often told the story of his parents' efforts to purchase a house in New Jersey town where he grew up. They were looking to move in a previously all-white community in the northern part of the state that had a great school system. They'd been denied multiple times for locations they knew were available, believed that their skin color was likely an issue, and houses suddenly vanished from the market. This was a practice called real estate steering, rampant across the United States, that's been addressed by federal legislation. And because of legislation, and with the help of local advocates, et cetera, Senator Booker's parents were able to fight the obvious discrimination they're experiencing and move into the house that they chose. Unfortunately, this type of discrimination still exists, but unlike in 1969, a lot of that discrimination has moved online. It's much harder to detect. There are millions of homes that you never know are for sale, job opportunities that are never presented, financing you never become aware of, all because of biased algorithms. We've seen medical patients funneled into the wrong treatment programs because the wrong proxies were used that ended up having a dramatic impact on their care. We've seen poorly designed mortgage approval systems that inexplicably denied loans to people who had just been approved recently. So specifically, the Algorithmic Accountability Act empowers the FTC to create a series of regulations and rules, providing a structured guidelines for assessment and reporting. It creates a baseline requirement that companies use the impacts, assess the impacts that their automated systems are creating, and requires reporting of those assessments to the FTC, creates a depository of information that people will be able to sort of look through that'll be somewhat anonymized. So you can't tell necessarily what companies are using these systems, but all to sort of shed some additional light on these processes that are being put in place and what's sort of happening behind the scenes. So that's pretty much it for me for my intro, and I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much, Rashawn. Next, we have Ben Rosen, who is special counsel in the area of privacy and data security at Baker Botts.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much. So I am currently at Baker Botts. Until very recently, I was at the Federal Trade Commission, where I was a senior attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection, leading investigations into a host of privacy and security issues there, and worked in the Bureau of Consumer Protection, advising the Bureau Director. And I spent some time on the Hill drafting privacy legislation on the House side, where I was there for FTC. So issues related to AI regulation is something that I've worked on a fair amount. And with all the talk that we've had so far today about kind of the need for regulation, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about some of the many laws and regulations that do already touch on aspects of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So one of those, I'll start quickly. I was going to use some slides, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of just doing this fairly quickly since we've got a short amount of time. But what the kind of foundational statute that jumps to mind is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which puts a host of obligations onto consumer reporting agencies that are making decisions about things like housing, employment, access to credit. The FCRA already imposes a number of obligations. So, for example, if a company were to buy scores that were developed using AI data and use those scores for purposes of making decisions about whether somebody might be a good tenant or a good employee, FCRA imposes obligations on providing things like an adverse action notice that gives some explanation about the reasons for a denial, and imposes requirements that the information is maximally accurate. Similarly, there's a statute, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, that puts obligations on creditors. ECOA is primarily geared at preventing discrimination in credit on the basis of protected classes. And the CFPB has put out a lot of guidance in the last couple of years about the need for adverse actions under ECOA, especially as more AI systems are being used to facilitate credit underwriting, some of which have great benefits in terms of expanding access to populations that previously might not have been able to get access to credit, but which nonetheless raise problems with explainability and risks of discrimination. The FTC Act as well is an area that already applies to artificial intelligence, and the FTC has put out a lot of guidance in the last few years about how they might use that. So the FTC Act is a broad, flexible statute, prohibits unfair, deceptive acts or practices. Unfairness has, a specific statutory definition, but it's really about injury to consumers. And as an example that the FTC has used for, in the case of algorithms and AI, they've specifically said that the sale or use of a racially discriminatory algorithm could be an unfair practice. Similarly, they've made lots of comments about how you have to truthfully represent what your algorithm can actually do and how you're using the data that underlies that. FTC enforces deception in a host of contexts, and it applies equally to AI, where, you know, there are concerns in the market that folks are dramatically overstating what artificial intelligence is capable of in certain contexts. You know, so all of that underscores reasons why auditing algorithmic data, both the inputs and the outcomes for bias, is extremely important. It's something I think that the agencies are already looking at in terms of, you know, making sure that folks that are using AI for important decisions have processes in place to evaluate that for discriminatory effects. And it'll be interesting to see if they can bring some cases on that. I want to touch very quickly on FTC rulemaking, which is something that has received a lot of attention lately because the FTC has said they plan to start a rulemaking to address what they describe as commercial surveillance practices, which is expected to include algorithmic discrimination. There's not a lot of information about exactly what that will include because nothing formal has been announced yet. And the commission, right now it's 2-2 with 2 Democrat and Republican commissioners. They're almost certainly going to have to wait for a 5th commissioner to be confirmed in order to get anything out the door. But algorithmic discrimination is expected to be a really key focal point, especially if you look at some of the folks that the chair, Alina Khan, has hired in her office, some of whom really focus on AI in particular. It'll be really interesting to see what they come out with. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over and look forward to the conversation.
Great. And our final panelist is Professor Sandra Wachter, who's at the Oxford Internet Institute.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to quickly share the screen because I have a couple of slides on this. Is that coming through okay? Yes, fantastic, thank you. Yes, so I'm Sandra Wachter. I am from Europe, so I'm gonna talk a little about the regulation that is currently being cooked up in Europe. To start off, it's a very, very, very complicated framework. It has hundreds of pages and annexes. It's almost not human understandable. So I have a couple of graphics here just to get across the basic idea and the structure of what's currently being done, which hopefully gives a good overview and then an interesting discussion around this. So what Europe has decided in terms of regulation is that they want to have a risk-based approach. So the idea is that you classify different AI systems according to the risk. And the classification system that you see here is that pyramid that the Commission came up with, on top with unacceptable risks, high risk, limited risk, or minimal or no risk. And depending on when you fall on the spectrum, you have to follow different rules. So let's start at the top of the pyramid. Unacceptable risks. So those are banned according to the regulation. When the first draft came around, there was a lot of excitement around this, and the media picked up on that quite heavily. And there was a lot of, let's say, enthusiasm and panic that Europe would just flat out ban certain applications. But I'm here to tell you that that's actually not really the case. So some of the things that are banned are, for example, face recognition software. And there was a lot of attention around that Europe would just ban those systems when it comes to law enforcement. However, the truth is that face recognition software can still be used in public places in order to prevent, investigate serious crimes and to fight terrorism, those kinds of things. So it's actually not really a ban. The other thing that was often portrayed in the media is that Europe will ban the so-called social credit scoring system that is currently developing in China. Well, the truth is that we really didn't ban that either. What we decided is that we're gonna ban scoring systems that use insignificant or irrelevant information that classifies unfit or misbehavior. And there's a lot of leeway of what that could actually mean. So we didn't flat out ban it. There's a definite exception there. And then there's a more fantastical idea of what the regulator AI does and can and cannot do, because there are rules around AI that manipulates or that exploits children or people with disability. And one of the examples that the Commission had in mind is, for example, a doll that talks to children, tells them to do dangerous behavior kind of stuff. So it's not really something that I, as somebody who's working in the field, would put on the top of the list of things we have to worry about. But that type of thing is currently under consideration as being banned. So you have, on the one hand, a more fantastical approach of what AI is currently doing. Those things are banned. And the bans that are in place don't really cover the dangerous part, like it would be for criminal justice purposes to ban face recognition software. The next step then is on the high risk, one lower down there. And we have come up with 8 different areas that we think are high risk. This includes law enforcement, education, employment, credit. And we can have a conversation whether those 8 areas are actually enough, whether we should add more. And it's an important conversation because it's actually quite hard to get new stuff on that list. If you find yourself to be in the business of education or employment or credit, what you need to do is an ex-ante conformity assessment, which means that you have to certify whether or not complying with things like documentation requirements, transparency, oversight, that type of stuff. Now, the interesting thing is, who does that assessment? And the answer is, in most cases, it will be the deployers themselves. So it will be the big tech companies certifying that they follow the rules. Well, the question is, what are those rules? How would we know about those? And here the answer is quite interesting. Those rules do not exist yet. So what you need to do is you need to self-certify that you're in accordance with the European standards on AI, but we're still in the making of coming up with those. So in the last couple of years, there will be the European Committee for Standardization that will come up with EU-wide rules on what good AI practices look like. The problem is that those standard setting bodies is a private body, so it's not a public body, which talks about, legitimacy. They have been criticized for not having the appropriate expertise to do so, and they're heavily influenced and populated by industry. So for all those high risk areas, what you end up is you have industry creating their own rules and then certifying if they follow those rules. And then we come to the last step. This is when it's about limited tests, limited risks. So this is something around talking to a chatbot or deep fakes. There are transparency requirements that say you need to know that you're not talking to a human. You need to know that you're actually engaging with something that is fake. So that's just transparency requirement. On the last, you see minimal or no risk where there aren't any rules around that. So at first glance, it looks very comprehensive and sensible, but once you start picking at it, you see that there is still a lot of work to do. So even though we're globally speaking the first to actually try to come up with an exhaustive regulation for AI, not everything that glitters is gold, but there is still time. We're still in the negotiation phase. It's definitely the right step in the right direction, but there is a lot of work to be done to give that regulation more teeth. And yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions around this in the Q&A. Hopefully that gives you like a rough overview of what Europe is currently up to.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for such great introductions. We've got several questions on the queue, so I'm just going to kick it off with one question for all of you, and then we'll start taking questions from the queue. So one of the things that struck me that potentially ties all of your presentations together, or that all the presentations have in common, right, is this idea that we've become a bit of a society, or that has this trust in numbers, right? And AI, at least initially as presented, is sort of this in somewhat, right, false objectivity, because we get an answer that is couched in numbers, right? And then another thing that came out was this idea of misalignment of incentives, right? I think this actually came out in a lot of the different discussions, that on the one hand, like, who's going to do the monitoring? Can companies really monitor themselves, right? And there's a misalignment potentially with the market forces fostering creation of AI and sort of the consumer interest, right? So keeping all of this in mind, the sort of my broad question would be, so once we sort of put all of these systems in place, how do we know that the AI system made the right decision, right? So what does a successful AI system look like? And what is our ultimate sort of measure of fairness, right? So how can we get at that, whether we've actually fixed the problem? What types of metrics or things are people thinking about? And I think any of the panelists could just jump in, and hopefully all of you will want to say something about that. But
I'm happy to jump in. I think your question is really, really important, and something that I do struggle as well, because there is definitely a tendency to blindly trust what the black box is telling you, in the sense that we already give it the name artificial intelligence. So it must be doing the right thing. It's very complex. Whatever is complex is definitely smart. And that's what the problem already starts with, right? It's not going to make better decisions than humans, because it's just learning from human decisions. And whenever we look at the past and we see that those human decisions weren't great, well, they won't be great in the future either, unless we start fixing them. And so the question of, can we really trust them, is just to say that we have to be very critical, because we have definitely very little oversight whether we made the right decisions in the past. So when you think about unequal access to education, we have data on those who have gotten into certain degrees. We don't have any data on the people that didn't get into it. So how do we really know that we made the right decision? You don't actually have access to the counterfactual universe. So how do you measure success? And that's critically hard to do. And that just means we have to be very, very mindful of that just because there's a score that tells you something, that we necessarily have to trust it, because as I said, the AI is not creating new data, it's learning from past decision making. And I can't hardly think of any area in life where there is no bias and discrimination. And so really, really, really mindful to think about how much trust we can place in those systems.
To piggyback on that, there are some pretty famous examples of algorithms that worked extremely well for what they were asked to do, but despite their accuracies, nonetheless have results that are incredibly biased and exacerbate inequality. So one example of that is in the healthcare space. There was an algorithm that was developed to determine who would get access to a medical program that was designed to have early intervention for people who were likely to experience really significant healthcare costs. It was associated with people who have, a number of severe comorbidities and who were going to be in and out of the hospital system a lot. And you could, through an algorithm, they could figure out, well, if we can get people in early and get them into early treatment sessions, they'll have dramatically better outcomes. And then to figure out who would be best qualified for this, they used as a proxy healthcare costs over time, which was very effective at finding people who were likely to benefit from these services, but also systematically excluded underrepresented minorities for a whole host of reasons, some of which are associated with historical distrust of the medical care system and decision-making in healthcare that sometimes doesn't treat all folks fairly. All of those things were reflected in the algorithm. And the reason that was able to be found, there were some researchers at UC Berkeley who published a big paper on this. They had access to all of the inner workings of the algorithm. They really opened everything up so that they could see how all of this was working and conduct a really detailed audit that surfaced all of this. And it certainly wasn't an intentional outcome that the folks were looking for, but it was nonetheless happening. And all of that, emphasizes why it's so important to look at outcomes from algorithms that are making these kinds of significant decisions, because even the most well-meaning algorithms that aren't using data that on its face appears to be discriminatory can have a major disparate impact.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for bringing up that that study. After that came out, Senator Booker and Senator Wyden took some action and reached out to CMS, FTC, and the largest healthcare companies that use either that specific program or programs that were like that to sort of assess, what their ideas were, what their processes were as they move forward, and how those things would be implemented. And you described the problem exactly. And that specific algorithm did get fixed. And so that problem did get changed. But I think that also harkens back to the initial question, how can you tell whether these things are working or not? And there probably isn't a metric that will say this algorithm or this automated decision system is successful. It'll be a constant process of watching, evaluating, tweaking things to make sure that we're trying to attack back to our, whether it's a company or societal goals of inclusion or whatever we're trying to solve for with a specific system. So it's definitely a constantly evolving, a steady process to find out what success is.
I'm really glad that we're talking about this blind trust in numbers, blind trust in software. I think there is way too much of a myth that decisions made by computer are logical, unbiased decisions made coolly, or that technology is maybe somewhat of a fundamentally positive force, when really it is a powerful force that can be powerful for both good and ill. I also think many people think about AI as a very progressive force. They think about it as the technology of the future, when very fundamentally it is a very conservative force. It looks at past data of what has been successful and says, we want the future to be like that. That's not particularly progressive unless you are very, you come to the data with a very different lens than we want to reproduce the successes of the past into the future. And in terms of the question you asked about what is a successful AI system and what is fair, in the computer science community, there's been a lot of discussion about all the different definitions of fairness. And maybe there's a wish that we could mathematically quantify what fairness is, and that just is not possible. It depends on, are you trying to optimize for the rights of individuals, for the rights of society, for all the species on the planet, right? It really fundamentally boils down to whose interests are going to be prioritized. And that's why we need to embed AI and technology like this in the political process by which we determine how stakeholders with different interests come to the table and decide how we're going to resolve that. The myth that this is going to be great for everyone, or it's very futuristic, or it's, all this is going to be just great is not, we're not telling people the truth. We need to tell people that they really need to come to the table and fight hard for the interests they want to see prioritized in these systems. Because what we're getting right now is the interests of developers, the interests of deciders. Mark, we are not getting the interests of individuals being decided about, or the interests of society as a whole, democratic principles, things like that.
Thank you so much for all of those answers. I'm going to start taking some questions from the queue because we have several of them. Hopefully I can ask most of them. One question that I think dovetails with what we just talked about is about US governmental regulation. So the question is, it's of a positive and a normative dimension to the question, which agencies regulate AI right now, right? And which agencies should regulate AI, right? Should it fall under current agencies? Should there be a new agency specifically designed to target AI? And if that's the case, what should be the composition? Should we think about expertise in technology or something else? So a description of the regulatory landscape as it stands now, and perhaps some sort of thinking about what it should look like.
So I touched on a little bit of that in my opening comments. There's no one answer as to what one agency regulates AI. I mean, part of that stems from the sectoral nature of regulation of privacy and data in the United States historically. Consumer facing applications of AI frequently are regulated by the FTC, that the FTC is a law enforcement agency more than a regulator. They're transitioning a bit to trying to do rulemaking, but they really bring case-by-case enforcement. Other aspects are covered by HHS, or things that are covered by HIPAA. When you get out of the sort of consumer-facing areas, it gets really murky quickly. There's a number of congressional committees that could touch on AI and regulation, all of which have their own sort of interests and oversight over different agencies. And as a result of that, you could pretty easily end up with a very fractured landscape. Your question about whether there should be a separate agency to regulate AI, this is a conversation that has certainly been going on in the privacy space to a degree. There are folks who advocate for a data protection agency instead of the Federal Trade Commission. Whether that's an actual, a practical alternative, given how difficult it is to get sort of any kind of baseline comprehensive privacy law through Congress. It's been, people have been trying for 20 years, and every day it's around the corner, but you never see it. My own view is that trying to launch a new agency where you would essentially end up with just a brain drain from the FTC who come over to a new agency, and it's going to be mostly the same folks who are doing this stuff. I don't think it's a very practical choice, but it's certainly one that is the subject of a lot of debate right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Gina.
No, please, you go, Rashawn.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was, coming off of that, I think that is a pretty accurate assessment of what's going on. A lot of people have proposed in varying levels of comprehensiveness, creation of a new agency or a new body that would oversee data, that would oversee privacy, artificial intelligence. And while that might be totally hypothetically a great idea, but the reality is it would sort of take a lot of resources, most likely away from other places, particularly the FTC. So say within this bill I've talked about today, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, it sets, it appropriates resources, additional resources for the FTC. One, they just need more money. And I think that's something that we hear consistently from the commission, and that would help sort of all their ongoing processes. But additionally, they need more money and more resources to get specific expertise. And say with some of the types of decisions that we're talking about today, these ones that are disproportionately impacting protected classes, et cetera, that have civil rights impacts, they need additional expertise that may be housed right now elsewhere in the government, or maybe more in the private sector. And so that's what I think is probably going to be the best way if we want to be realistic about getting the best possible sort of regulation and enforcement.
Those are both really fabulous answers. And I would like to just mention a couple other places within the government to keep an eye on in the US. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is definitely, they're working on an AI risk management framework. The Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House has been working on AI Bill of Rights type things. The DoD has a bunch of responsible AI frameworks and principles for responsible AI. The National Science Foundation, as it applies to research in AI. And one of the big things I'd like to mention, following on the comment about kind of the fractured landscape, is state versus federal. And it's a very interesting, especially when you're talking about digital privacy type things. I think everyone wants action at the federal level, especially tech companies, interestingly, because they don't want to have to be subject to different regulations in all these different states, and countries around the world. They wouldn't want one thing for everywhere. So you see some action states like California and Virginia, but interestingly, everyone agrees maybe there should be legislation at the federal level. What tech companies I think want is, yes, let's have one rule, but let the rule be basically let us do what we want. That's not completely fair, because I think there's a lot of tech companies that say, please legislate this space so that we we can act ethically and be on a even playing field with other companies that have to act ethically. So it's a really complicated space.
I wonder, Sandra, just to follow up, if you can bring sort of the European perspective to this fragmentation, right? That there's this fragmented ecosystem which might or may not be beneficial, and how has Europe tackled the fragmented nature of where AI shows up, right?
Yeah, I think we have the same conversations over here as well. Do we need an AI law? We have that step now. Do we need an AI agency as well? I think this conversation always comes up when there's new technology. I remember when the same discussion happened around the internet. So I see this as just a trend with a new technology coming into the space, and the question of whether it's distinct enough to warrant to have an actual agency taking care of it. And I'm actually on the fence with that, because AI is just a technology that touches so many regular spaces at the same time, because you have, data protection authorities that will need to say something on that. You will need to have a word with equality bodies. You will need to talk to competition legislators. You will need to think about consumer protection laws. You will need to talk about tax authorities, because that is also being disrupted by this technology, obviously. And so all of a sudden you have all those fragments that AI is currently disrupting. And the question is, does it make more sense to bundle it? Because as already said, very often data protection authorities or equality bodies or consumer protection agencies don't necessarily have the technical understanding yet of what AI can and cannot do, let alone what it means in an employment sector or what it means in finance and all of that. So at some point, it might become so complicated that you really need a centralized approach. What's happening in Europe at the moment is that at least there's an awareness of that. So there's a lot of effort being put into trying to open up the channels between the regulators more openly and try to learn from each other in a way. So I think that's already a really good step forward, but that's obviously a learning exercise for everybody. But at least there's an awareness to try to have a more collaborative approach to trying to tackle this issue.
Great, excellent. So we have a number of questions about the Algorithmic Accountability Act, and let me see if I can sort of put them all together. So one question is about the coverage of the Algorithmic Accountability Act, that it covers only certain organizations and not small organizations. And so a bit of a fleshing out, what was the calculus there? What are we worried about? What are we worried about by excluding some companies? And then maybe comparing that to the EU approach, right? Which is not necessarily, as I understand it, excluding categories of industries, right? But it's just basically looking at levels of risk. And then let me add to that, I'm going to find the other question about the Algorithmic Accountability Act. There was also another question about whether it's going to address companies in the law enforcement space. So our law enforcement systems covered entities. So I think I'll stop there because there's a lot of other, let me just let you answer that, and then we'll see how much time we have to get more follow-up questions on the act.
Yeah, no, thanks everyone for sort of being curious about the piece of legislation. It's not trying to be everything for all automated decisions, trying to sort of take a subset and make sure that we're covering these well. And so what also the bill does is it's mainly constructed to create a new level of transparency so that the way that we're evaluating these problems in the future, sort of you might think of this as like a first step that would inform subsequent more comprehensive data or privacy, artificial intelligence legislation. But this first step helps us to actually address what real problems are there. Right, so it looks at algorithms and companies, developers of such, that touch a significant amount of people, specifically by private companies that are in these critical decision spaces that we talked about. And so there are things that are other important things that aren't covered, right? So we talked about the I think in the question had Clearview AI and its use by law enforcement. So that this is not designed to cover that. That is, I think, an issue that there's some overlap. There's a lot of other people who are supportive of that, and I think it's deserving of its own proposal, which I think a lot of things that would target it have been sort of kicked around Congress. Specifically, Senator Booker and some others had signed on to a proposal that would outlaw any sort of facial recognition for law enforcement entities within the federal government. It's a bit harder to address the state and municipal law enforcement entities, but we're working on ways that we can try and do that as well. So that's definitely a problem that is seen, not covered by this specific act. And I think with the size of the companies, a lot of it is based on, there is attention paid to the idea that there are small companies that sort of punch above their weight by their sort of outsourcing. They may only have a small amount of customers, but those customers use those systems or algorithms to affect a much larger proportion of people or number of people. And so we're trying to cover some of them as well, and without sort of drawing too big of a net here.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic answer. And I know one of the things that I didn't appreciate at all until I spent some time on the Hill was to what extent committee jurisdiction influences, the scope of a bill. It's really hard to cover kind of all things as you are, dealing with consumer-facing applications, which are going to be in front of, the Commerce Committee, but then you want to get into law enforcement, that's going to be in front of Judiciary or other committees. There's a lot of territorial wrangling that just makes the process of getting a bill through is hard enough as it is. When you start laying on more committees, it makes it almost impossible to get something through in the current climate. And about covered entities, I mean, if you look at the proposals in not just AI legislation, but privacy legislation, what constitutes a covered entity is always, it's a really hard question to find that right balance between covering folks that are processing a lot of data and putting procedural requirements on companies that, the reality is a lot of sort of outside audit and assessment practices, these are burdensome. These are things that are hard for a small company to do. Where you draw that line is really tough. And you can see that reflected in a lot of the different proposals, which vary pretty dramatically in terms of, who's covered for what.
Great, thank you so much for those answers. So next question is about, in some ways about remedies, right? So the question is about, given that the technology, the AI technology, it's a black box, right? We don't really know the algorithms, or at least the public doesn't know that. What do you think should be the rule in criminal matters or potentially civil matters? I'm adding that. In terms of disclosing the algorithm, right? I know that from my neck of the woods, thinking about IP, I know that algorithms are often protected by trade secrets. And so what is your take on this, right? And are any of these proposals tackling the disclosure aspect of the algorithm, and should the algorithms be disclosed, and if so, in which circumstances?
I've done quite a bit of work in this space with criminal justice software, especially probabilistic genotyping software that matches evidence found at crime scenes to possible suspects. And there are many other examples of criminal justice software that I would like to see much more willingness of courts to hold them to high standards for admissibility and to grant expert witnesses under protective order at least access to the details of the source code, the internal testing, the verification and validation, and also more and more to hold them to high standards of independent verification and validation on the front end. There are many, in my opinion, really troubling stories of insufficiently verified and validated software used in the criminal justice system. Again, if you look at the incentive structure, right, of who is developing those systems, who is purchasing them, And what happens when there's a bug report? You know, if someone says that must be a bug because I didn't do it, is the answer, okay, we'll look into that? Or is the answer, oh, you're just complaining because you're guilty? And the software never, ever gets better.
Yeah, I think this is a super important question, the question of remedy, and also one that I'm trying to get my head around on how to solve it. Because yes, Gina's absolutely right that, you know, the explainability issues are there. I think it's even worse than that, because the current frameworks that we have might not actually be sufficiently suitable to get us where we want to be. So what I mean by that is that very often every framework that we have in place, for example, non-discrimination law, data protection law, all of that is based on a complaint-based system. So the idea is that you find out that, you know, your data has been misused or you have been discriminated against. And what is it that you do? You go and bring a complaint. That makes a lot of sense if you are in a human-human setting. So with algorithms, the situation has changed a little bit because those algorithms learning things about you behind your back without you being aware of it. So an algorithm can infer your gender, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your religion, your ability, and use that information against you. For example, not showing you certain job advertisements, not showing you advertisements for housing or credit, giving you higher prices and all of that, but you just don't know about it because you're only in your little filter bubble. So a complaint-based system completely breaks down at that point. And we really have to think about new ways of making sure that those rights are protected, because I think the current remedy structure doesn't really fit the bill anymore.
Great. We probably have time for at least for one more question. Maybe let's see. Maybe we have a couple of time for two questions. So the next question, I'm going to collect a couple of questions about the EU regulations. But I think the answer, we could also do a comparative answer and see whether the US should approach this type of regulation. So one question is, if the EU regulations contemplate collecting outcome data from regulated entities, so should regulation not just be ex ante, but also ex post collecting outcome data? If so, what data and how are they? How is it collected, and what regulatory tools other than sort of ex ante rules are contemplated? And then also about the EU, whether we think that the UK is going to adopt the EU AI Act or not. A slightly separate question, right? So the first one is sort of a bit broader, but then also a curiosity about, is the UK going to buy into the EU rule, or is it going to go more towards the US system, which is perhaps more favorable to commercial interests?
Yes, very, very, very quickly. So yes, in terms of ex ante, ex post, a lot of the stuff in the AI Act has to do with ex ante obligations, but they're also ex post things. For example, there are requirements of post market monitoring. Those are also not really fleshed out. It's not really clear how that is supposed to work yet, but the idea is that it's a mixture of ex post, ex ante mechanisms. We have GDPR floating next to it as well, which is covering a lot of the space that is also going to be relevant when it comes to AI. So when it comes to data protection, there's actually not that much in the AI Act because GDPR and the Privacy Directive are covering most of that space already. So they probably have to be read together, but it's a mixture of both of those things. And we will see how it pans out. As I said, a lot of that is still in the drafting situation. We will see how the next versions look like. But yeah, both of those sides are being discussed. When it comes to the UK, we'll see. Looking at what's currently happening in the data protection space, I think there's a good chance that we're gonna look at more the US perspective and then try to align ourselves with that type of regulation. I can see it with the drafts that are being currently discussed in data protection. So we're moving away from GDPR kind of stuff, and we're considering doing significant things that are worrying. So for example, in GDPR, we did have a right to contest certain automated decisions. That is currently being considered to be completely taken out, for example. So that's, gives you a sense of the direction that we're going into. There is also a lot of consideration whether consent is still a necessary legal basis. Shouldn't we just move everything to legitimate interest? So again, trying to chip away on the individual level rights side of things that are very traditional of continental Europe. And the UK individual rights kind of frameworks are not necessarily the ones that are held in high regard. So judging from this, I see there could be a trend that we're moving in a similar space that the US is, because a similar trend is already happening with data protection laws.
And I know we only have 4 minutes, so I thought instead of asking a final question, I think it would be great if I just let you sort of finish, make it whatever comment that you have not been able to make, so that we'll end the panel with your comments. And maybe we could go in reverse order. I'm just thinking we could go Sandra, Rashawn, Ben, and Gina to sort of wrap up the panel in the next 4 minutes.
Yeah, I think for me, honestly, this was a fantastic panel because I get to hear about US approaches, which is not necessarily something that you hear a lot in Europe. We look at what the US is doing, but it's always very, very nice to actually talk to people who have dedicated their life to understanding what's going on there. So if I had one wish for the future, it would really to be trying to make closer connections to understand what's going on in that space, because in a lot of ways, I think we can learn a lot from each other and have a good exchange on lessons learned, for example. So when we consider new regulation, we could say, oh, look at the US has been doing this. They've been very successful with this approach. Oh, look how Europe has been doing it. That didn't go so well. And so there could be a very good learning exercise and just a resourceful thinking of bringing different sides of the continent together. And at some point, it would be great to even expand that even more, because it would be great just to see how other people deal with regulation, because AI is on everybody's agenda.
All right, I'll go ahead and go. So yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time to hop on today. I'm enthusiastic about the future of AI regulation and data privacy and data collection regulation as well, specifically with, I think everyone has seen in their own lives how decisions that are happening that they're not aware of are impacting what they see and how their lives play out, specifically with social media. Everyone is on and you see that things that you see are different than what your friends might see. And so I think that we've seen recently so many people making choices about the way that they choose to use their data or have others handle it. And I think that as those abilities are disseminated, people will have more, put more pressure on their lawmakers to make decisions that benefit individuals and that'll help proposals like ours to actually be able to move forward and be enacted.
I don't know if I have any great parting words to add to that, but it's exciting to see so much attention on privacy and artificial intelligence and uses of data in a way that I think has grown over the last few years and will hopefully push Congress into taking some action. I'm skeptical that in this Congress we're going to see anything done, given how close we are to the midterms now. I think the focus is going to be on the states in the short term, but it'll be fascinating to see how issues surrounding fairness of algorithmic decision-making works its way into some of the proposals. I mean, hopefully we will have a chance to see some of the kind of laboratory of the states working and have some of that kind of collaborative feedback that Sandra was talking about in terms of, learning from each other's different regulatory proposals. Unfortunately, I think it's too often you kind of get something done and then it's very hard to change once you've got the law on the books. But I think over the next couple of years, it's going to be fascinating to see how these issues develop, and hopefully we'll see some progress.
Well, I feel very humbled to get the last word of this amazing panel. It's been a real pleasure to be here. I think back to our question, will the US and EU approaches lead to fairness and accountability? And while I think we've talked a lot about why it's so hard, right? You know, in the US, two parties, states, agencies between the US and Europe, we haven't even talked about the different model that China is following, or the way all of our attention is now on what's happening in Ukraine, right? Like it is, but all of that is, I don't think we have a choice. I think this is really a defining question of our age. You know, you don't have to look around much to see the impact that automated decision-making systems are currently having on the rights of individuals and whether or not we live in healthy, functioning societies. So no matter how hard it is, I think the answer just has to be yes. And we have to say, yes, it will lead to that. And we just can't stop. Because what is the alternative? Is letting AI become a force that that leads to oppression and manipulation, and does not amplify the rights of individuals or healthy societies. So may out of all of these discussions in laboratories come resolve.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Have a great afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at our next program.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.